My name is Jordan, and I'm 29 years old. I grew up in a picture-perfect family, or at least that's what everyone else saw. My parents were always the epitome of success in my small town. Dad was a corporate lawyer with a hefty salary, and Mom was a successful real estate agent. We lived in a spacious house in the upscale neighborhood, and on the surface, it looked like we had everything. But underneath it all, things were never as they seemed. Growing up, I always felt like a second priority in my own family. My parents were more concerned with maintaining their social image than actually being there for me. From an early age, it became painfully clear that my existence was more of an inconvenience to their lifestyle than anything else. My father would often tell me that I needed to do better or live up to the family name, while my mother would casually brush off any of my achievements, as though they were expected, not worth celebrating. I had straight A's in school and won awards, but all I ever received from them were cold, disinterested nods. They didn't want a child. They wanted an accessory to their image of a perfect family. A child who could do well enough in school to not embarrass them, but whose dreams, desires, and needs were secondary to theirs. If I wasn't helping them maintain their reputation, I didn't have much value in their eyes. I was always just there, doing my part. It wasn't just about academics. It was about making sure the house looked pristine, that I stayed out of the way, and that no one could say anything bad about our family. Every time I had a passion or a dream that wasn't in line with their image of success, it was quickly dismissed or belittled. But the tipping point, the moment that changed everything, came when I was nearing the end of my high school years. At that time, my mother lost her job without any explanation. She simply stopped going to work, and my father, who had always been the breadwinner, was fired from his law firm. Our once perfectly stable life crumbled in a matter of months. Suddenly, we weren't living in the spacious house with 2 cars in the driveway anymore. We were struggling. Bills piled up, and they couldn't hide it anymore. The very same family that had once projected the image of wealth and success now looked like a shell of its former self. I hadn't realized it before, but I was now their crutch. They'd used me to keep their lives intact. Suddenly, the responsibilities that came with being the child in their family went from what seemed like harmless tasks to a full-on weight they dumped on my shoulders. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about saving their lives, upholding their image, and preserving their status. I had worked my entire high school life for something more than that. I had worked not only to prove that I could be something in my own right, but also to earn a scholarship for college, so that I could finally escape this suffocating life I was trapped in. The scholarship was a godsend. It was everything I had dreamed of, a chance to leave the toxic environment I had been forced to endure. But when I excitedly told my parents about it, the response wasn't joy or pride. It was a demand that I stay home and work full-time instead of going to college. They asked me to give up my future to help them pay their debts. My father, ever the calculating figure, suggested that I stay home, take a year off from school, and help them with their financial problems. I could use the scholarship money to help the family out. They expected me to sacrifice my future for their survival. Their words echoed in my head. Real adults help their family. College can wait. When I confronted them about it, I learned the worst thing of all. The modest college savings my grandfather had set up for me had been completely drained. They had used it to pay off their debts without even asking for my consent. They didn't even apologize. Instead, they justified it by saying it was necessary for the family's survival. That was when I realized something that would stay with me forever. My parents didn't care about my dreams. They didn't care about my future. I was just another resource to be exploited to keep their image intact. And so at 18, I left. I packed up what little I could, rented a small apartment in a nearby city, and enrolled in college on my own. It was the hardest decision I had ever made. I was terrified, but I knew it was the only way I could start over. It wasn't easy, of course. I juggled waitressing, tutoring, and whatever odd jobs I could find to get by. But there was freedom in it. A freedom that I had never felt in my parents' home. For the first time in my life, I was free. Free to live for myself. Free to pursue my dreams without constantly being held back. I kept my distance from my parents, only speaking to them on holidays or for obligatory calls. It was the only way I could get through the day, the only way I could heal, and it worked. For a while, I was finally building something for myself. I had a job offer after graduating in a city far from my family. I was starting fresh, thousands of miles away from the constant manipulation, the guilt trips, and the emotional blackmail. I felt like I was finally where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to do. I thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd finally let go of their grip on me. But I was wrong. 2 years passed after I moved away, and things seemed to finally settle down. I had built a life for myself in this new city. Friends, a career, an apartment I could call my own. I wasn't rich, but I was happy. I felt at peace for the first time in my life. I thought my parents would just stay out of my way, accept that I was doing my own thing, and leave me alone. But just when I thought I could breathe, I received a message that knocked the wind right out of me. It was from my mom. The text was short but packed with weight. She said they wanted to reconnect and that they were planning a visit with a special surprise for me. She went on to say that this surprise would make everything right between us. Their message was so casual, like nothing had ever happened, as though we hadn't spent years in silence, with me constantly trying to rebuild my life, while they had buried me under their financial chaos and emotional manipulation. It was like they had no concept of the damage they had done. At first, I was stunned. I had barely heard from them in 2 years, and now, out of nowhere, they were reaching out as if nothing had ever happened. They acted like they had just been waiting for the right moment to make everything better with a visit. I could feel the familiar guilt creeping in, the old conditioning that told me that family is family, that I should be the one to make the first move. But that voice inside me was louder now. I had worked so hard to get to this point, to be free of them, and now they wanted to waltz right back in, as if the past hadn't happened. I told them politely that I wasn't ready for a visit, that I appreciated their gesture, but needed time and space. I tried to stay civil, but inside, I was furious. I hadn't even fully processed everything I had gone through, and they thought that sending me a surprise would just fix everything? I couldn't let them back in just like that. Not after all the years of sacrifice I had made, but when I declined their offer, they didn't take it well. The guilt trip started almost immediately. I began getting messages from other relatives, all trying to convince me to change my mind. Your parents miss you, they said. It's time to let the past go, they said. Some of them even hinted that I was being harsh, and that my parents were just trying to make amends. It felt like everyone was suddenly forgetting what I had been through. They expected me to be grateful, to fall back into the role they had created for me. I couldn't believe it. They were all playing the same game, trying to guilt me into doing what was best for them, not me. The messages kept coming, and soon enough, it wasn't just family. Mutual friends started reaching out, asking me why I was being so stubborn. Why couldn't I just forgive them? Why couldn't I accept their apology and move on? The more they pushed, the more I wanted to shut them out. They had no idea what it had been like for me. How could they understand the years of emotional blackmail, the manipulation, the constant expectation that I would sacrifice my future to hold up their crumbling image? I began to feel like I was drowning in a sea of guilt. Was I being unreasonable? Was I overreacting? Part of me doubted myself. I felt guilty for not accepting their peace offering, for not giving them a chance to prove they had changed. But deep down, I knew that their change wasn't real. It was just another grand gesture, another attempt to buy my forgiveness. It wasn't about healing the relationship. It was about getting me to forgive them on their terms, without doing the hard work it would take to actually change. That's when I started to get more intrusive messages. People began asking more personal questions, commenting on my life choices, suggesting that I needed to accept their help to heal my wounds. They didn't get it. I wasn't wounded because I needed their money or gifts. I wasn't broken because they hadn't given me enough. I was broken because they had never once seen me as a person with my own needs. To them, I was a tool, a means to an end. And every time they reached out, I was reminded of just how little they respected me. I wasn't a person to them. I was an asset, something they could use when it suited them. My whole life, I had been expected to just shut up and take it. They didn't care about my dreams, my aspirations, or my happiness. They cared about how I could help them. And every time they sent a message, or called, or tried to guilt trip me, they reminded me of that fact. I spent a few days thinking it over, and then I made the decision. I would stand my ground. I would stop letting them control the narrative. So, I wrote an email. I wasn't going to just fall into the trap of their guilt anymore. I told them everything. I told them that their grand gestures, their surprise peace offerings, meant nothing if they didn't address the root of the issue. I told them that if they really wanted to fix things, it would have to start with respecting my boundaries. No more surprise visits, no more guilt trips, and no more using money as a way to buy my forgiveness. I was done with that. I wasn't asking for an apology. I wasn't asking for them to shower me with gifts or tell me how much they missed me. What I needed was respect. I needed to see that they understood what they had put me through, and I needed to feel safe. If they couldn't give me that, then I was done. I didn't expect them to respond positively, but when I hit send, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had set the terms for how this was going to go. I wasn't going to be manipulated into going back to the way things were. Not anymore. The next morning, I received an email from them. I was hoping for some form of acknowledgement, but instead, it was the same old story. They started off by thanking me for my honesty, but then they began to shift the blame onto me. "You're rejecting us," my father said. "You're pushing us away when we've tried so hard." They didn't get it. I had spent years being the one to give and give, to sacrifice myself for them, and all they could see was their own hurt. This time, I wasn't going to be swayed. I stood my ground, but I knew this wasn't over yet. The tension between us kept escalating, and soon enough, I realized that it wasn't just them trying to push me around anymore. The guilt trips, the manipulations, and their constant attempts to control my life were only part of the bigger picture. The problem wasn't just with my parents, it was with the way I had let them shape me. Growing up, I had learned to ignore my own needs in favor of theirs. I had always believed that I owed them something, but I was beginning to see the truth. I didn't owe them a single thing. Not anymore. For the first time in my life, I was starting to see their behavior for what it truly was: emotional blackmail. My parents had always been more concerned with their own image, their own reputation, than with me as a person. They didn't care about my dreams or my well-being. I was just another part of their image, a piece of the puzzle they needed to make everything look perfect. And when I didn't fit into that image anymore, they started to turn on me. Their email was like a punch in the gut. They didn't even acknowledge the real issues, the things that had caused the rift between us in the first place. Instead, they twisted everything to make me feel like I was the one at fault. The same old story. They were the victims, and I was the ungrateful daughter who didn't appreciate everything they had done for me. My mother's message hit me harder than my father's. She had always been the one to push me the hardest, to make me feel like I was nothing if I didn't live up to her expectations. Her message was full of guilt, as if I was somehow responsible for their unhappiness. She wrote about how they had given me everything, how they had worked so hard to provide for me, and how they just wanted to be part of my life again. It was like reading a script, the same lines they had said to me 100 times before. I felt my blood boil as I read through her words. How could she still be so blind? How could she continue to make me the villain in their story? She didn't see me, not as a person, not as her daughter. She saw me as a tool, a way to fix their broken lives. They didn't care about what I wanted. They didn't care about my happiness. They only cared about themselves. That was when I realized I had to stop giving them the power to make me feel guilty. No matter how much they tried to twist the narrative, I couldn't let them win anymore. I couldn't go back to that place of emotional dependency, where I constantly questioned my worth because of their constant demands. I had already given so much of myself to them. I had given up my dreams, my future, and my peace of mind to appease them, and it hadn't been enough. Nothing was ever enough. It was time to break free for good, but the hardest part was accepting that I might never get the closure I wanted. My parents weren't going to suddenly wake up and see the damage they had done. They weren't going to change. I had to stop waiting for that moment when they would realize their mistakes and apologize. It wasn't going to happen. I couldn't keep putting my life on hold, hoping for something that was never going to come. I thought back to all the times they had belittled me, all the times they had made me feel small and insignificant. I had always tried to be the good daughter, the one who would make them proud. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I sacrificed, it was never enough. And that was the hardest truth to accept. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my boundaries weren't just for me, they were for my own sanity. I had spent too long letting them walk all over me, and now it was time to put my foot down. I decided to write one last email, one that would make my stance clear once and for all. This time, I didn't pull any punches. I told them exactly what I had been feeling for years: the frustration, the anger, the years of manipulation that had been eating away at me. I told them that I couldn't continue to be their punching bag. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for their happiness, because they had never truly cared about mine. I also made it clear that I was done with their guilt trips. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me anymore. I wasn't going to apologize for setting boundaries. I wasn't going to be the daughter they could control with guilt and money. I didn't want their money, their gifts, or their empty apologies. All I wanted was respect. I wanted the kind of relationship where we could communicate openly and honestly, without any manipulation or power struggles. Sending that email was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also the most freeing. It felt like the final step in taking back control of my life. I wasn't going to let them hold me hostage anymore. I wasn't going to let their emotional baggage weigh me down. But the hardest part was still ahead: the waiting. The waiting to see if they would truly respect my boundaries, or if they would continue to push, continue to try to break me down. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done trying to please them. And the funny thing is, I started to feel better. I started to feel lighter. The more I stood up for myself, the more I realized how much of my life had been consumed by their expectations. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells. I wasn't trying to please anyone. I was just living my life on my own terms. That's when the next message came. It wasn't from my parents. It wasn't even from my aunt. It was from a cousin of mine, someone I hadn't heard from in years. She wanted to know why I was refusing to let my parents visit. She said they were worried about me, that I was pushing them away for no reason, and that was when I realized just how far they were willing to go. Not only had they ignored my boundaries, but they were now trying to involve the rest of the family in their campaign of guilt. They wanted me to feel like I was the one causing the problem. They wanted me to feel like the bad guy, but I wasn't going to back down. I couldn't. Not anymore. I moved to the new city with a sense of relief that I can only describe as liberating. The fresh air, the new surroundings. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was free. At last I could live life on my terms, make my own decisions without the constant cloud of guilt or obligation hanging over me. I settled into my job, and for the first time in years, I was genuinely happy. It had been 2 years since I'd moved, and the silence between me and my parents had been a welcome break. I didn't feel the need to keep in touch, not after everything. I didn't want to talk to them, and they didn't seem to try very hard either. At least that's what I thought. Then one day I got a message from them. It was a simple text, or so it seemed at first. But as I read it, my heart sank. They were reaching out to me again. After all this time, they were trying to reconnect, acting like nothing had ever happened. They kept hinting that they had a surprise for me, something that would make everything better. They said I'd be so happy when I received it, and for a moment I thought, maybe they've changed. Maybe this time it'll be different. But deep down, I knew better. Every time they tried to fix things, it was always with money. It was always a grand gesture to manipulate me, to get me back in line. So when they said they had a surprise for me, my immediate reaction was suspicion. I didn't trust them. Not anymore. I hesitated. I didn't want to let them back in, not after everything they had put me through. But the guilt they instilled in me over the years started to creep back. I felt that old tug, that familiar pull to be good, to be family-oriented, to not let the past ruin what could be the future. Maybe, just maybe, they had changed, and they wanted to make it right. I considered it, I'll admit it, but when they pushed harder, sending more messages, trying to guilt-trip me into accepting their visit, I stood firm. I politely declined. It wasn't just about my past, it was about setting boundaries. I couldn't afford to go back to the way things were, not for their sake, not for anyone's. What happened next made my blood run cold. Suddenly, all these messages started flooding in from other relatives. They were all pressuring me to reconsider. "They're your parents," they said. "You should give them a chance. Family is family." It felt like I was being surrounded, cornered by a group of people who hadn't been there when I was struggling. But now, they were all speaking for my parents. It was as though everyone was reading from the same script, pushing the same narrative. The messages continued. My aunt, who had always been more of a passive bystander, reached out to me too. She told me my parents had been going to therapy for a year now, and they had seen the error of their ways. The surprise, she said, was a trust fund they had set up for me, a financial gesture to make amends, to show they were committed to change. I was stunned. On the one hand, the fact that they had been working on themselves seemed like progress, but on the other hand, it felt like the same thing all over again. Money, just another grand gesture to buy my forgiveness. I didn't want their money. I didn't want them to think that a trust fund could erase the years of manipulation and control. I didn't want to be bought back into their lives. After everything I'd been through, I didn't want a trust fund. I wanted respect. I wanted them to understand why I had left in the first place. I wanted them to recognize how they had treated me, how they had dismissed my dreams, used me to fulfill their needs, and never once cared about what I wanted. So I did what I knew I had to do. I wrote them an email, and I laid it all out. I thanked them for the trust fund, for the effort they'd put into therapy, but I told them, in no uncertain terms, that their approach was wrong. I explained that if they wanted to rebuild our relationship, it wasn't going to start with money. It had to start with respect. They had to respect my boundaries. They had to respect me as an adult, as someone who had fought for a life of independence. I told them plainly that I would not be accepting their visits unless we set clear boundaries. I couldn't just fall back into their control because they had finally realized they made a mistake. It needed to be more than that. We needed to communicate openly and honestly. We needed time to rebuild trust. But when I hit send, I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. Instead, I felt a wave of dread. I feared how they would react, and as expected, they didn't take it well. My mother's reply came first. It was long and filled with guilt. She told me how disappointed she was in my response, how I was breaking up the family, how I was pushing them away. She made me feel like I was being cruel, like I was rejecting their love, their sacrifices. And then my father's message came. It was blunt. He didn't understand why I had refused the trust fund. He said I was disrespecting them, that I was ungrateful for everything they had done for me. But it was all the same manipulative tactics, the same guilt trip. They hadn't changed. They were still trying to control me. I was furious, but I didn't back down. I sent them one final message, making it clear that if they continued to cross my boundaries, I would take legal action. I wouldn't let them continue harassing me, trying to guilt me into submission. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. They didn't stop. I thought after everything, I would finally be left alone. But as usual, my parents just couldn't let go. The messages didn't stop. My phone buzzed constantly, emails poured in, and every conversation with a family member seemed to circle back to the same tired narrative, how I was the ungrateful daughter who had turned her back on her family. The guilt tripping was relentless, and even after everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might be the one in the wrong. Was I really too harsh? Was I really shutting them out because I was too stubborn? But I had to remind myself of what had happened before. I wasn't just rejecting them out of spite or holding on to grudges. I was standing up for my peace, my boundaries, and my well-being. All the things I had fought so hard to create. And yet, they still couldn't see it. To them, this was just another power struggle. They were still trying to manipulate me, pulling all the emotional strings to get me to bend. I couldn't back down now. Every time they tried to guilt trip me, I was reminded of the years I had spent walking on eggshells around them. Every holiday was spent pretending everything was fine when, deep down, I knew they didn't care about my happiness. They only cared about how I could serve their needs. I was never enough, unless I was the perfect daughter who gave up everything to keep them comfortable. It wasn't easy. The guilt still crept in. I felt bad. I miss my family sometimes. I missed the idea of having a supportive, functional family. But I had learned that they would never be the family I needed. The more I reflected, the more I realized how toxic and controlling they had always been. My boundaries were never respected. Any time I stood up for myself, it was twisted into something negative. Any attempt to express my feelings or my struggles was ignored or minimized. They couldn't see me as their daughter, only as someone to use when it was convenient for them. One night I received another email from my mother. It was a long one, filled with the same emotional manipulation. She was heartbroken that I was shutting them out, asking how I could possibly throw everything away after all they had done for me. The line that hit hardest was when she wrote, "You will regret this, you know." That familiar phrase, the one that used to haunt me, the one they used to say when they were trying to guilt me into submission. I didn't respond to the email. I had gotten used to ignoring their attempts to manipulate me, but this time, I felt something shift inside me. The guilt was fading, replaced with a stronger sense of clarity. I wasn't being cruel. I was protecting myself from further harm. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much control they still had over me, even from a distance. The phone calls and emails were just another form of their manipulation. They were trying to chip away at the progress I had made. It was exhausting, but I knew I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them break me again. I had already spent years of my life living in their shadow, and I wasn't about to let that continue. I needed to focus on my own life, my career, my relationship, and my peace of mind. That's when I decided I needed to take it a step further. I had been patient, tried to set boundaries, and explain myself as best as I could, but they weren't listening. They were still trying to force their way back into my life on their terms. I had no choice but to take more drastic action. I sent them one last message. This time, I didn't hold back. I told them that if they didn't respect my boundaries, I would involve the authorities. I wasn't playing around anymore. I had made it clear before that I wanted nothing to do with their guilt trips and manipulation, but they refused to take me seriously. If they continued to push, I would have no choice but to take legal action. I didn't want to escalate things. I wanted peace, but I had given them every opportunity to do things the right way. Now, I was preparing for the worst. I had no intention of letting them walk all over me again. The days after I sent that final message were tense. I waited for a response, knowing that it could be the moment that changed everything. Would they respect my wishes? Or would they push even harder, forcing me to go further? I didn't know what to expect, but I was ready. I had reached my limit, and I wasn't going back. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of power. I was no longer the helpless daughter they could manipulate. I had taken control of my life, and no one, no matter how much they tried, was going to take that from me. The days that followed were a blur of messages, guilt trips, and new tactics from my parents. I had spent my whole life letting their actions dictate my sense of self-worth, but now, something was different. Their desperate attempts to guilt-trip me into reconciliation, to paint me as the villain in their narrative, didn't have the same effect on me anymore. I was starting to see the whole situation for what it was: manipulation, pure and simple. Despite everything they had done, part of me still wanted to believe that this surprise, this trust fund, could be the olive branch they were claiming it was. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. This was just another way to try to control me, to buy my forgiveness, to make me forget everything that had happened. I wasn't going to fall for it. I kept thinking back to everything I had been through, the emotional blackmail, the years of manipulation, and the way they had used me as a tool to maintain their perfect family image. It was like they couldn't understand why I wasn't grateful, why I wasn't willing to just accept their offerings and pretend like everything was okay. But I wasn't going to pretend anymore. I sent them one last message, a clear and firm statement that my boundaries had to be respected. I reminded them that I had already spent my whole life trying to keep the peace, trying to live up to their expectations, but now I was done. I told them I wasn't going to accept any visits, any gifts, or any grand gestures unless they proved they were capable of real change. I knew this wouldn't be easy. They had always seen me as a means to an end, a way to fix their problems or enhance their image. I knew they would probably be angry, but at that moment, I didn't care anymore. I wasn't their pawn, and I wasn't going to continue being their emotional punching bag. I had my own life to live, and I was done letting them invade it. The final straw came when they reached out again, this time through my aunt. She wanted to know what was really going on, why I couldn't just forgive them. It was clear that they had already spun their own version of events, trying to paint me as the ungrateful daughter who couldn't see how hard they had worked for me. But I wasn't going to let them manipulate me anymore. I had to admit, their attempts to guilt-trip me still stung. After everything they had done, after all the pain they had caused, part of me still felt guilty. I still wanted them to love me, to see me for who I was, but I had spent too long letting their love come with strings attached. I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. At the same time, I wasn't sure if I could keep going like this, constantly on edge, always worried about what they might do next. I had built a life for myself, but they were always lurking in the background, trying to break through my defenses. I wasn't sure how much more I could take, but then something changed. I realized that I had nothing left to prove to them. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't owe them forgiveness. The weight of their expectations had been hanging over me for so long, and now, for the first time in my life, I was free. Free to live the life I had always wanted, free to make decisions for myself. I knew that cutting them out of my life completely might leave me with scars. I might never get the closure I wanted, but I also knew that I would never heal if I kept letting them back in. Their behavior had been toxic for too long, and I was done trying to fix it. I was done trying to fix them. As I finally hit send on that last message, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't easy. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but I had no regrets. It was the only way forward. From now on, I will live for myself. I would make decisions based on what I needed, not on what they wanted from me. It was time to put myself first, to stop sacrificing my happiness for their approval. The silence that followed fell like the calm after a storm. I knew they might try again, but I also knew that I was stronger now. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first left home. I had built a life for myself, and I wasn't going to let anyone, least of all my parents, take it from me. For the first time, I could breathe, and that felt like the biggest victory of all.